The Holy Gospel can be found on page 785 of your pew Bibles, if you'd like to follow along. The Holy Gospel, according to St. Matthew, the 4th chapter, verses 18 through 22. As Jesus walked by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who was Peter, and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fish for people." Immediately they left their nets and followed him. As he went from there, he saw two other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, in the boat with their father Zebedee, mending their nets, and he called them. Immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. This is the gospel of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Please be seated. And I want to invite Dr. Christopher Johnson to join me up here for a conversation about vocation and scars and life and purpose. And welcome.
Good to be back. Thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely. Yep, might want to turn that on. That's probably... There we go. How does that work?
Good to be back. Thanks for the invitation.
Excellent. Well, maybe just tell folks about yourself a little bit.
Well, the most important thing I've heard so far is that I'm your friend.
Yeah, yes, absolutely.
So I'm also a father, a spouse. My wife and I met at Gustavus in a water fight. That's a whole other story. Back in our student days 30-some years ago. I grew up on a farm near Litchfield. Went to Gustavus, the seminary thing you've already mentioned. Have made much of my career in higher education at Gustavus and otherwise. And now, the last 5 years have been out in the world on my own, still around the notion of vocation, calling, purpose, meaning, and so on, but in a more entrepreneurial sort of way. Doing facilitation, retreats, workshops, speaking, one-on-one individual, what am I doing with my life kinds of coaching conversations. And I get to hang out with you occasionally.
It's very fun, very fun. Thanks. Well, again, thanks for being here. So this Lenten season, we're talking about scars and scars that we carry. We've talked about physical scars, emotional scars, scars of grief and loss. We want to talk about vocational scars today, which honestly, to me, it's kind of the squishiest of the terms. It's kind of the hardest to get our mind wrapped around what that is. It might make sense just to kind of start with the word vocation. I mean,
Sure.
As you understand it or teach it or think about it, describe vocation to us.
One of the places I can start with that, Todd, is to go to the root of the word itself. The word vocation in English is based on a Latin root, vocare, which means calling, or to call, or invite, or summon. So I like to think of vocation in that broadest, deepest sense as a life calling. It, in our culture, tends to be reduced to job or profession or occupation or career. So in English, there, we talk about vocational schools, and you think of being prepped for a trade, which is all great. When Martin Luther was doing his thing 500-ish years ago, vocation was really a central part of what he wanted to revive and rehabilitate in the culture in which he was located, because at the time, the word had been reduced down to that sense of calling, but only for a select few, only the priests and the monks and the nuns and the folks who, one way or another, told a story about having been zapped by a lightning bolt by God and sent into the ministry. And Luther said, no, it's everybody. It's by virtue of being human. Because we have been created and loved by God, all of us has a vocation to be God's presence in the world, to live out God's love for all of creation by being who we are. So vocation in English is also related to the word vox, V-O-X, in Latin, which means voice. So it's about living into, finding, and speaking out your own voice. The Quakers have a phrase that I really love: let your life speak. Let your life speak. Listen for the voice of vocation Who are you really when you're being most deeply yourself in ways that make a difference to others? Those are the kinds of things I think about when it comes to vocation. Calling, invitation, summons, being truly who you are, deepest sense of identity, truthfulness about who God has made you to be in ways that you can then see God working through you in the billions of particularities of any given day. And isn't necessarily reducible only to profession, occupation, career. One way to think about that is to observe that a very small percentage of the population of the planet actually has paid work. But we would all want to say that all of us has a vocation. And all the more power, too, or all the better fortune if your own sense of vocation happens to be able to be lived out in work or job or profession or occupation or career. But they're not necessarily equivalent. It's more about, again, who you are, who God has created you to be in ways that can make a difference for those around you.
And we talk about that in our Lutheran perspective as that call comes in our baptism. That's when God reaches out and calls us by name, and then we receive this gift of love, life, but also vocation and call. Is that
right?
Yeah, cool.
Yes. Again, to be Lutheran for a moment. So Luther's famous phrase, one of them, is justification by faith, right? That God is the one who tells us, I created you, I made you, I love you. No matter what you do, no matter who you are mine. And therefore, because you are that person, anything you do in the world can be an opportunity for you to live out that truth. So justification, to use that word, being loved, saved by grace by God first. Justification and vocation go hand in hand. Vocation flows from God's stamp on our forehead, if you will, or the sign of the cross at baptism on our forehead.
Sure. That's great. So as we think about vocational scars, to have a scar means that you have to have a wound first. Something has to happen. Tell us a little bit about vocational wounds and scars, and kind of what does that mean?
So both in my own life and in the lives of those that I've worked with over the decades, there are probably an infinite variety of wounds and scars in as much as we are all different. But I could maybe name or point to a few different trends or patterns, if you will, many of which I've experienced myself. There's the version that comes from struggle to figure out yourself. When I was graduated from college, I went on to seminary right after college because enough other people told me that I would be a good pastor, good with people, good in front of people, religion major, what else are you going to do with that, so on and so on. That was also a period of deep depression for me because I did not feel the internal kind of heart sense that is who I really was supposed to be. So that floundering with trying to discover your own gifts and talents, your own deepest, truest sense of self, in some ways that can be a problem of abundance, a paralysis of too many options. Some folks just flounder in that way. Another flip of that same coin might be a wound or scars that come from over-identifying one's self, one's worth, with one's work. I have had periods of that as well, where I burned myself out. I've made myself really unhealthy. I've done damage to relationships because I too closely identified my worth, my value, myself with my work. So that's another kind of scar. So there's the not knowing, there's the knowing and overdoing it. Another one might be knowing who I am and what I'm called to do with my life and not being allowed to do it because other people perceive me to be somebody other than they want me to be. Think of sexual harassment or the kinds of discrimination that take place because of racism and so on. Or age discrimination, being told in one way or another that you're no longer valuable because you just aged yourself out of the job market or you've aged yourself out of a particular career. My own version of that particular wound was after 13 years of directing a campus-wide initiative over at Gustavus, my alma mater, around this notion of vocation and calling and working with everybody on the campus. The whole program was eliminated by a president who wanted to take the institution in a different direction. So in that sense, my life's work was taken away from me, or at least that expression of it was. And in effect, instead, one of the images you've heard me use, Todd, is that at that time I felt like I was being pushed off a cliff, not of my own choosing, but that the updrafts have been really good, and I sprouted some wings, and God has helped me to find other ways of living out my life's work, while also reminding me that my life is more than my work, or other than just paid work. So wounds can take lots of different shapes, having to do with all the different ways in which we struggle with identity. What am I doing with my life? What is my life doing with me? Choices that other people make kind of on our behalf or inflict on us. They can take lots of different shapes, but those are some of the key patterns that I've seen and that I've experienced myself.
Sure. How does one heal when your identity, when your purpose, when your reason for, you feel like your reason for being has been harmed or taken away from you, or how do we recover from those kind of wounds?
Well, we already used that word grace. In my own experience, it's been important for me to remember some of the starting places that in our conversation, that it's not really all about me in the first place. In the same way that the gospel reminds me that my salvation is not mine to work out, it's already been given to me. I've struggled with it, but I've also been able to be reminded, part of that updraft that I talked about before, that after being pushed off the cliff, I never did hit the jagged rocks down below, because part of the updraft had to do with recognizing ways in which I was being held and surrounded by not only God's love, but God's love through the people around me. They, in their own ways, were living out their vocations by being my family, my friends, my colleagues, and we all have an opportunity to be that kind of neighbor, loving the other. So healing can take the form of remembering that it's not up to us in the first place, that the first and last in every word is always that God loves us, that we are surrounded and held and nested, if you will, by realities that are bigger than ourselves, that the voice in my head that sometimes comes with vocational woundedness about what's wrong with me, what have I done wrong, I'm too small for this occasion or this work, sometimes is a matter of, well, that particular setting or this opportunity might be too small for me. And again, that is rooted in the sense that who I am is primarily always, first and last and always, loved child of God.
I think to remember, too, that, the idea of a call from God is not a one-off event. It's an ongoing piece. I think of the gospel story, Jesus calling the disciples. They were deep into a career. A life, and got pulled in a different direction. Is that a part of healing, too, do you think? Does God's call shift or evolve in that way? Or
yes, it can be. It can take the form of a surprise. Sometimes we fight against it, so the biblical stories are full of characters. We don't really get a sense of it from the disciples, the fishermen, but Moses, for instance, or many of the characters throughout the Bible have experienced some kind of calling from God. They hear a voice, and their first reaction is, not me, pick somebody else. You got the wrong guy. So there can be that sort of give and take, but I think of it going back to the notion that vocation is tied to voice and calling and so on, there's a conversational dimension to it, a give and take, listening for and responding to. Sometimes maybe even it can feel like arguing with God, bargaining. Some of those kinds of things fit into it. But yes, it's also a lifelong process. It isn't one of the things I often had to remind students at the colleges that I've worked at is that your calling in life is not going to be handed to you when you walk across the stage at graduation along with your diploma. For one thing, it's not just a commodity that you can buy off the shelf like everything else that we've come to be conditioned in life is we can just buy our way into whatever. And it is a lifelong journey. And it does change over time. An image, thank you for having this ready to go just in case. An image I like to think of is of a tent pole, right? One of these kinds that has the segments that are linked together by the elastic cord. So over time, the segments might be thought of as the different jobs we might have, or the different roles we might play throughout our life, the different relationships we have. So I introduced myself partly as husband and as parent and as friend and so on. The elastic cord that ties all those together, or the different pieces of my life, childhood, adolescence, college student, grad student, professional, so on, earlier life, youth, emerging adulthood, middle age, retirement, so on. All these different ways of thinking about the segments or pieces of your life are connected, tied together, held together in a flexible, pliable, changeable way by the thread of vocation that links it all together. That thread that, in spite of all the things that change, the different pieces of my life, there is a unity to it, which is, or a continuity to it, which is, again, primarily, I am a child of God, and I might be surprised along the way. I might literally hear God's voice often through relationships with others, suggesting, prodding, inviting, summoning me to a different expression, a different segment of the whole, so to speak. Mm-hmm. But knowing ultimately that it all ties together in ways that if we were to have some more of these and unfold them all, eventually we could erect a frame for a life, if you will, that we could inhabit. We could set up a tent and move in. And that's sort of how I think of those discontinuities or those pieces of vocation, the surprises that can come in the way that we heard about in the gospel today.
So one last question. So if people are thinking about, wondering about, if they've been wounded, if they're trying to figure out their sense of purpose, and we keep hearing this idea, I love this idea of voice, both the voice we speak, but the voice we hear. I mean, how does one listen for that? In 30 seconds or less.
Yeah.
I'm kidding.
How does one listen? The first phrase that's coming to mind is pay attention. Notice. So another image that's coming to mind, I mentioned growing up on the farm. One of my favorite memories, I was probably 7 or 8 years old, maybe 9, during a holiday break from school around Christmas time, the Christmas New Year's holiday break. Really cold, back in the days when we had good old-fashioned winters of the sort that we had this year. And I was helping my dad clean the barn. And we filled up the manure spreader. I sat on his lap. We drove together out to the far end of our farm, turned on the manure spreader, emptied it out. And as that load was finishing, we came to the top of a hill, and we're just about ready to turn around and go back when down the other side of the hill, we came across this magnificent herd of deer, which were just milling about and sort of pushing the snow aside to find grass and so on. And we stopped Dad, just shut off the tractor. I can still, thank you for this memory. I can still hear the ting, ting, ting of the engine as it was cooling in the cold. And he pulled me closer in on his lap, and we just sat there for what feels in my memory like 20, 30 minutes. It might have been 5 minutes, I don't know. It was cold. And we were just astonished at the life that was happening around us and in front of us. And I'm thinking of that when I said pay attention. I'm thinking of that as an early invitation offered to me by the situation and by my dad to notice, to be astonished, to be open to awe and wonder and curiosity and the gifts of the moment. That's almost 50 years ago now, and as I said, I can still hear the ting of the engine. I can sort of feel the warmth of being held more closely by my dad. What a gift in an otherwise ordinary, run-of-the-mill, cold Minnesota farm morning. I'm thinking about these disciples. Again, they were, as you said, they were just doing their thing. They were just living their lives. And yet something caught their attention. A voice, an interaction caught their attention. So listening really is that. Listening for the voice of vocation really is just that. It's listening. It's being open, being receptive, being surprisable, noting what in the immediate moment is being called forth from us. Very quickly, one of the kind of bumper sticker formulations of vocation that I find helpful is by a fellow named Frederick Buechner, who talks about vocation as the places in your daily life where your heart's deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. And that can take so many different shapes in the course of any given day. It might be that, you care about each other. We care about each other. And that today, the person sitting next to you, when you ask, how are you doing? Maybe that person, at that moment, summons the courage to say, well, right at the moment, not so well. And the response is, I'm sorry to hear that. Tell me more. Vocation is emerging in that moment as simply the calling to be open to the need. The world's deep hunger at that moment takes the shape of a neighbor in need who simply needs a listening ear. So it is about listening. It's about being open and available and attentive to what's happening in your life at this moment, and all the gifts and surprises and awe and wonder and astonishment that can come when we are, especially when we are open and paying attention.
Amen. Let's thank Chris for being with us here today. Thank you so much.